Little Orphant Annie's come to our house to stay, and wash the cups and saucers up, and brush the crumbs away, and shoo the chickens off the porch, and dust the hearth and sweep, and make the fire and bake the bread, and earn her board and keep. And all us other children, when the supper things is done, we set around the kitchen fire and has the mostest fun listening to the witch tales that Annie tells about, and the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. Once there was a little boy wouldn't say his prayers, and when he went to bed at night away upstairs, his mammy heard him holler, and his daddy heard him bawl, and when they turned the kivers down, he wasn't there at all. And they seeked him in the rafter room, and cubby hole and press, and seeked him up the chimbley flue, and everywheres, I guess. But all they found was this his pants, and round about, and the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. And one time a little girl 'ud allus laugh and grin, and make fun of everyone and all her blood and kin, and once when they was company and old folks was there, she mocked 'em and shocked 'em and said she didn't care. And this she kicked her heels, and turned to run and hide. They was two great big black things a-standing by her side, and they snatched her through the ceiling, for she knowed what she's about. The goblins'll get you if you don't watch out. And Little Orphant Annie says, when the blaze is blue, and the lampwick sputters, and the wind goes woo, and you hear the crickets quit, and the moon is gray, and the lightning bugs and dew is all squenched away, you better mind your parents and your teachers fond and dear, and cherish them that loves you, and dry the orphan's tear, and help the poor and needy ones that clusters all about, or the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. Hi there. Welcome to my Fortnight of Fright. I'm hoping, I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to do this, but I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to read a poem, a Halloween or scary or spooky poem, every day in the fortnight leading up to Halloween. Maybe even Halloween itself, but I don't know what I'm going to be able to do because my schedule is pretty tight the next couple of weeks. But I've been looking for an excuse to read some poems on YouTube for a while now, and this seems like as good a reason as any, because frankly, there's a lot of doubt about poetry, I think. A lot of people who kind of either feel it isn't fun or feel that they aren't up to the challenge of poetry, but I think it's actually a lot more accessible than we make it. I think that if you approach an individual poem, it can be very accessible. I've got some personal grievances against some authors who went out of their way to make their poetry hard to understand, and I don't think that's the way it should be. Well, it might be good enough for their poems, I guess. But anyway, this is Halloween poetry specifically, or scary poetry, or spooky, or however you want to think about it. And I decided to kick off the Fortnight of Fright with Little Orphant Annie by James Whitcomb Riley for a couple of reasons. First of all, I've always really loved the refrain at every stanza when they talk about the goblins will get you if you don't watch out. There's a really nice cadence to that, and it feels appropriate. More importantly than that, though, it's not necessarily a poem about monsters or goblins or bad things happening to people who misbehave. It's about kids telling themselves those kinds of stories, just sitting around the kitchen fire, and this was written back when kitchens had fires regularly. And I kind of think that's more in tune with the modern sense of Halloween. There's a lot of history to what makes Halloween the holiday it is nowadays, and it's definitely very different nowadays. But I think that what it is nowadays is still something pretty cool. And the sensibility of kids just enjoying scaring each other a little bit, that seems fitting. So it was good to kick off for that reason. Another reason is that James Whitcomb Riley, I don't actually know as much about him as I wish I did, but James Whitcomb Riley is one of the many great Midwest writers. He's known as the Hoosier Poet and is an Indiana boy. I kind of like that he's the Hoosier Poet. He was the Poet Laureate of the United States for a while. And I didn't know this till I started researching him for this, but he actually had a bit of a rivalry with Samuel Clemens. I don't know how deep that rivalry went. I don't know if it was actually a rivalry or if it was just two people who shook their fist at each other whenever they met each other as a kind of friendly antagonism. But I did find out that even though they had rivalry, whatever form of rivalry it was, that Samuel Clemens, who you might better know as Mark Twain, actually praised his work and said that James Whitcomb Riley's work made him weep for his lost childhood, that something about James Whitcomb Riley's poems spoke to childhood. Now, one of the reasons I thought that was interesting was that when I was prepping my notes, I was like, well, you know, he works with dialect a lot. He tries to get dialect correct, just like Mark Twain did, so finding that connection between the two was a little bit of fun for me. One other thing about the dialect, though, is that not everyone's a fan of his dialect. Some people thought that his dialect was a crutch. While most people really enjoyed him, and while his poetry was famous, he was also said by one or two people out there that he used his dialect writing as a way to kind of mask problems with the actual structures of his poems. And, you know, on the one hand, I can kind of see that. When I was reading that poem out loud, there were a few times where you kind of have to take a bit of an old Hoosier accent, and I don't mean old Hoosier, I mean, like, I don't know the word for that, but you do need a kind of drawl to make it, like the line when Little Orphant Annie is mimicking the wind going woo. It feels like there should be an extra syllable there. In fact, there's even a hyphen in the ooh, as if the reader is meant to add an extra syllable. But, you know, when you read it out, I actually kind of think it works that way, so I'm not sure that it's fair to call that a failing of the poem. The other thing I want to say about James Whitcomb Riley, since I seem to be giving a bit of a treatise on him right now, is that he once tried to publish a poem under the name of Edgar Allan Poe. He sent it to a magazine under a pseudonym, or a newspaper under pseudonym. Pseudonym, I forget. I can't talk right now. And he sent it in and said that he thought he'd found a poem of Edgar Allan Poe's. And a few places published it. A lot of people didn't believe that it was Poe's. They said, we don't think this is good enough to be a lost poem of Poe's. So he actually was involved in a little Edgar Allan Poe scandal, and he was found out eventually, and it kind of led to a career shift. But that was pretty early in his career, and he definitely bounced back. And I mention this because, while I'm not planning on reading The Raven necessarily, I'm pretty sure I'm going to have at least one poem by Edgar Allan Poe before we get to the end of the Fortnight of Fright. And who knows, maybe it will be The Raven. But Edgar Allan Poe wrote a lot of other poems aside from that. Anyway, I've talked more than long enough. Thank you for listening to Little Orphant Annie on my Fortnight of Fright. Bye, everyone.